Good evening, everyone. I am so excited about this that I may fumble. So laugh and be patient. I've never introduced a president before. I think that's the problem. Nita went by, goes, presidents and their first ladies, dramatically speaking, is the creation of the veteran acting and writing team of husband and wife, William and Sue Wills. After 20 years of operating their own theatrical company in a resort in Ocean City, Maryland, the couple is now in their 19th year of bringing us the life stories of 33 presidential couples. Amazingly, the Wills have appeared together on the stage over, now sit tight, 8,600 times, and still counting. They are not impersonators, but hope that their costumes, dialects, and demeanors will help recreate these historical characters. Mr. and Mrs. Wills have performed in 35 of our 50 states, and in 2013 presented all 33 of their presentations in 5 days to benefit the Wounded Warrior Project. After you see them tonight, you really won't be able to understand how that was possible. I lost my place. Such a feat has never been achieved before. They are a true working team, with William researching and creating the scripts while Sue edits his work and creates the costumes, many of her own design. With their Presidents and First Ladies program, William and Sue hope that presenting the personal side of our first couples, they will become more than just names read about in history books. And it is with such pride that they present to us a presidential press conference with our 35th President and First Ladies, Jack and Jackie Kennedy. And please give them a rousing welcome.
Well, thank you for that very warm welcome. You know, as the cow said to the Maine farmer, thank you for a warm hand on a cold morning. Before we begin the press conference, I do understand, I'm not quite sure what this means, but there are objects nowadays that make these ringing sounds all over the place, you know. So if anyone does have any of those objects, if you could silence them before we begin the press conference, I would deeply appreciate it. Now, we are here today for a press conference, and you are going to hear the questions at the same time we will, and we are going to try to answer these questions very candidly and also very truthfully. So if you don't mind, please listen along with us.
Mr. President.
Yes.
Would you tell us all about Marilyn Monroe?
Marilyn Monroe, second question.
President and Mrs. Kennedy, if you had to describe your childhood in 2 words, what would they be?
Happy, sad.
Now, I would say sickly and beat up.
I was born just 3 months before the stock market crash on July 28, 1929. Although my childhood came during the Depression, it was an extremely happy time for me. My father, John Bouvier, was a well-to-do stockbroker. When the market crashed in 1929, it was my mother's father who assisted my father financially by loaning my parents a substantial amount of money and allowing us to live in a Park Avenue apartment, rent-free, provided my father stopped his womanizing. Jacques Bouvier believed he could have any woman he wanted, and, well, he usually did. But these were wonderful years for me, as my mother taught me how to ride and jump horses. I was always in my riding outfit and never felt happier than in the saddle. I also grew extremely fond of my father during these years. Ironically, as most of the nation was coming out of the Depression, my sadness was just beginning. In the summer of 1940, when I was 11 years old, my mother and father divorced. My younger sister Lee and I were caught in the middle of a horrible power struggle, and I became very depressed. Then in 1942, my mother married Hugh Auchincloss. We were again financially secure, having beautiful homes in which to live. But I missed my father deeply.
Well, I was born on May the 29th, 1917, in Brookline, Massachusetts, the second child of what would eventually become a family of 9 children. 6 years after my birth, my father Joseph became a bona fide millionaire, and over the years he would become vastly richer. And as for me, most of my childhood was spent being sick. I had scarlet fever, bronchitis, measles, chickenpox, whooping cough, German measles, mumps, diphtheria, allergies, colds, flus, hives, an irritable colon, a weak stomach, asthma, jaundice, appendicitis, tonsillectomy, pneumonia, urethritis, and a bad back. Actually, the left side of my body was slightly smaller than the right, and I would eventually wear a small lift in my shoe to try to correct that problem. Also, the rupturing of a spinal disc while playing football at Harvard certainly did not help that situation. In fact, I was so sickly as a boy, my brothers used to joke that a mosquito took a great risk in biting me. With my blood, the mosquito would die. Well, that explains the sickly part of the answer, and now on to beat up. As you can gather from what I said, I was a scrawny little kid, and therefore I got beat up quite a lot, especially by my own older brother, Joe. Now, my father instilled in all of us a great spirit of competition, but nowhere was that spirit more manifest than between Joe and myself, and most of the time I was on the receiving end. But I wasn't afraid to challenge my big brother. I remember one day we had the big bicycle race. Now, we each left going in opposite directions around the house. So we come back around the front, racing towards the finish line, and we were directly facing one another. And you know, neither one of us would move over a foot. So at the finish line, of course, we crashed. Well, I ended up getting 28 stitches for my victory, and my brother Joe was totally unhurt.
Mr. President,
Yes, sir.
how did you become a war hero?
That was absolutely involuntary. They sank my boat. No, to answer that in a serious question in detail, my father had to pull a lot of strings to have the Navy overlook my illnesses and my physical problems. I was eventually sent to the South Pacific, to the Solomon Islands, as captain of a PT boat, a PT 109. On August the 2nd, 1943, we were rammed by a Japanese destroyer, and the boat sank. My heroics in saving the life of one of my men and eventually bringing about our rescue back home, bringing back our rescue, made the headlines back home, and I was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal along with a Purple Heart, and a little bout with malaria would reward me with some recurrent malarial symptoms for the rest of my life. But there was also a more tragic effect from that PT boat incident. For the first time in my life, I had actually beaten my older brother Joe at something. I had become the war hero first. And I don't know if that was the reason or not, but days later, Joe volunteered to fly an extremely dangerous bombing mission. They were going to try to take out a German V-2 rocket installation. I mean, basically, that plane was packed from front to back with explosives. It was a huge flying bomb. The men were to leave the plane ahead of the target, and the plane would go in and destroy it, but for some reason, the plane exploded prematurely, and Joe died. It was a horrible loss for our family, but it would also make a tremendous change in my future. Because you see, up until then, it was Joe who was going to be the politician in the family, and now that mantle fell to me. So after a very brief stint, actually as a newspaper journalist, following my discharge from the Navy, I was elected to Congress in 1946, actually taking my seat, of course, in 1947. Yes.
Jackie, 1947 was an important year in your life as well, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Golly. Gee, thank you for asking. That year, a New York Society columnist chose me as Queen Debutante of the Year after my coming out in Newport, Rhode Island. Then it was on to Vassar for me, followed by a year at the Sorbonne in France, where I learned to speak French fluently and truly developed my lifelong affection for French art and literature. After all, the Bouviers were of French descent. I finished my college education at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and it was at that time that Jacques and my paths crossed.
Mr. President,
Yes, sir.
how did the romance between you and Jackie begin?
At a dinner party, I just leaned across the asparagus and I asked her for a date.
You did not. We did officially meet at a dinner party given by mutual friends Charlie and Martha Bartlett. Jack called me the next day, but he did not ask me out, so we went our separate ways. I on a tour of Europe with my sister Lee, while Jack began campaigning for a Senate race in Massachusetts. Then he went on a tour of the Far East.
And experienced another brush with death. I'd almost died when I was just 2 years old from the scarlet fever. Then back in 1947, while on a fact-finding tour of Europe, I fell deathly ill, and in fact, I was at that time given the last rites of the Catholic Church. And it was during that illness that doctors discovered I did have a problem with my adrenal gland. I found it difficult to fight off infection, but that was relieved, first by use of certain medicines, and then eventually by use of the drug cortisone. But in Japan in 1951, my fever rose to 105 degrees. I became delirious, and they actually packed me in ice to try to lower the temperature. My brother Bobby was with me, and he telegrammed Dad that there was little hope for my survival. But survive I did. And while recuperating, Bobby and I spent a lot of time talking about the future. Now, in my brother's mind, there was nothing more important to him than his wife and his children. Children, he told me, gave you hope for the future. Well, I was then 34 years old, and maybe it was time for me to finally just settle down.
Speaking of settling down, it is well known that you had many female friends, so now would you tell us about Marilyn?
When I started, I said I'd answer the questions candidly and truthfully. And I guess I better do so now with this rather persistent question tonight. I will tell you all that I know about Maryland. Maryland was one of the original 13 colonies. It's actually bounded by Delaware, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and West Virginia. And that's what I'll tell you about Maryland. These questions are as tricky as those I would get asked back in Washington. And I do remember in particular this one female reporter who came into my office one day.
Senator Kennedy, as the inquiring photographer for the Washington Times-Herald, I want to ask you, what do you think of the Senate pages?
Well, I believe it would be a very good idea if the senators and their pages would actually change places now and then. So, Jackie, I read in the New York Times recently that you're engaged to be married.
Yes, the stock market broker, John Husted. He's the man of my dreams. Well, he was the man of my dreams until May 17th, 1952. John could not make it to an exclusive Washington dance, so at the suggestion of Martha Bartlett, I invited Jack, and a spark was lit. Weeks later, I slipped my engagement ring off my finger and let it fall in John Husted's pocket. And that's when Jack's and my courtship truly began, and I first came in contact with Jack's family, including his sisters and sisters-in-law, whom I like to call the Rah-Rah girls.
Well, they did not exactly take to Jackie either. In fact, when she informed my family that her first name was not Jacqueline, it was rather Jacqueline, one of my sisters-in-law whispered, "It rhymes with queen." But there was a member of my family Jackie really liked, and that was my father. And she would say things to him that none of us would ever dare to even think of saying. I'll give you a good example. So one night we're finished dinner, and that's where we always held important discussions across the dinner table. Well, this night, Bobby and my father were going back and forth about how best to battle air pollution. Well, Jackie pitched in with,
Call out the Air Force. Have them spray the congested urban areas with Chanel No. 5.
and on another occasion, my father was relating how he gave each of his children $1 million when they turned 21, so they would be financially secure, and if they wanted to, they could just tell the old man to go straight to hell. Well, Jackie joined that conversation by asking,
Do you know what I would do if you gave me $1 million? I'd ask you for another million. Although I was very different from the other girls in the family, I do believe that Joe might have liked me best. Jack and I kept our public relationship very low-key, although privately it was quite passionate. And even though we were apart often, our dates together were really quite normal. Movies, many of which I paid for because Jack never carried any money with him. Dinners and games at the homes of friends, and making out in his convertible. Jack was not the great romantic. He did not write me great love letters, although once I did receive this postcard from Bermuda. Wish you were here, Jack. Our wedding took place on September 12, 1952 in Newport, Rhode Island. Jack was 36 and I was 24.
Some newly married couples find a hard time adjusting to married life.
Yeah.
How were your first years?
well, I think I will let my wife actually answer that, Jackie.
Well, I found out right away that we would be under the public eye, as just 1 month after our wedding, Jack arranged for us to be on the television program Person to Person. Well, the main thing really for me was to be what my husband wanted. He would not and could not be married to someone who tried to share the spotlight with him. I'm just an old-fashioned housewife, really. When all runs smoothly, the food is good and the flowers fresh, I have much satisfaction. I like cooking, but I'm not really very good at it, so I took a cooking course. And when our cook had a free night, I was ready to show off for Jack. But I burned the meal. Smoke filled the kitchen. I pulled the lamb chops from the oven, but the oven door collapsed, and fat and grease spattered all over the floor along with the chops, which I just picked up and put back on the plates anyway. The chocolate sauce was burning and exploding. What a smell. I could not even get the spoon out of the chocolate. It was like a rock. The coffee had all boiled away. I burned my arm badly. It turned purple and looked horrible. Then Jack arrived home and saved the day.
I took her out to dinner. You know, Jackie never liked politics, but she really did help me tremendously. It was Jackie who made me into a much better public speaker. She began to give me suggestions for ideas to include in the speeches, and she even took a course in American history, so she'd learn a little bit more about my profession.
I suppose, except for the fact that Jack was away almost every weekend, constantly campaigning. Our first year of marriage was pretty normal, but it almost ended after 1 year. And not from marital problems, but because Jack almost died.
By the August of 1954, my back was just causing me excruciating pain. My weight had fallen to 140 pounds, and I had to use crutches, which I absolutely hated. So I decided to undergo an operation where they would attempt to fuse my vertebrae. However, because of that adrenal problem, my chances of survival of that operation were at best 50-50. But I'd rather be dead than have to spend the rest of my life on crutches.
Well, as expected, infection did set in. And for the first time in my life, I really and truly prayed. Jack went into a coma. Finally, Cardinal Spellman was called to administer the last rites of the Catholic Church. For 1 month, Jack hovered between life and death. He underwent a second, more successful back operation in early January, and it was during that recovery that he wrote his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Profiles in Courage.
And by the spring of 1955, I had returned to the Senate, but there still was the pain. And it was around this time that my physician, Janet Travell, began to inject Novocaine directly into my back, sometimes several times a day. Plus, I had to get those cortisone injections occasionally, and I had a ton of other pills and things to take daily. But Jackie and I did buy a new home, Hickory Hill, a place large enough for the family that we were desperately trying to have.
Well, 1956 brought about 2 major surprises. I finally became successfully pregnant.
And I made a gallant try for the vice presidency at the Democratic Convention that summer. Now, I lost that bid, but the ease with which I got as far as I did convinced me that 2 years later, the bigger prize of the presidency would be within reach. And although Jackie was some 8 months pregnant, she was right there by my side all throughout that vice presidential ordeal.
So, Jack, can't you stay by my side now?
Well, now, Jackie, you know I've had this trip to the Mediterranean playing with my friends for months now.
But I've less than a month to go. And with the miscarriage I had last year, please don't go with them.
Jackie,
stay with me.
I'll be back in plenty of time.
But Jack went. And just 1 week later, on August 23rd, I was rushed to the hospital. There I gave birth to a baby girl whom I called Arabella. Only Bobby Kennedy was by my side. And Arabella was born dead. It took Jack 5 days to return from that vacation to be by my side. At first, I blamed myself for Arabella's death. Oh, I should have stopped smoking. Maybe I just couldn't have children. I shouldn't have let Jack leave my side. But then I turned my feelings of guilt outward. It was the hectic pace of that convention. It was politics in general. Why wasn't my husband at my side? Severe depression set in. Jack again immersed himself in politics, and finally I left for England to spend time with my sister Lee. I began to enjoy myself with glamorous hunts and parties. That was when rumors of our marital problems began appearing in print. Time magazine ran an article that Jack and I were getting a divorce. It also aired the latter rumor that we had reconciled because Joe Kennedy offered me $1 million to stay with Jack. Well, it's true I did meet with Joe, and we talked. Jack and I got back together, but I made him sell Hickory Hill. Maybe we would never need a large home for a family.
But that thought did change a bit when on November the 27th, 1957, by cesarean section, Jackie did give birth to a little girl, Caroline.
It was the happiest day of my life.
Mr. President, tell us about the election of 1960.
Well, let me say a couple of things about elections in general. They are never easy. If we have any politicians out here, listen carefully. Because if you think you've got name recognition, I'll guarantee you, you'll never have enough. And I'll give you an example of that from 1960. I'm out campaigning. And I come upon this really rather small restaurant, but right over its roof is one of our big campaign billboards, you know, John F. Kennedy for president. So I just went in, I thought I'd get a chocolate shake. So I walked up to the man at the counter. Hello, I'm a John Kennedy. He just gave me this blank stare. I said, you know, I'm running for president. And he looked at me again, and then he finally drawled, president of what?
Remember how I told you that Jack never carried any money with him? Well, his mother, Rose, decided to do an informal poll of her own of taxi cab drivers. And she asked this one fellow for whom he was going to vote, and he replied, that young Kennedy fella. Then the driver noticed the address to where Rose was going, and he asked her if she was by any chance related to John Kennedy. And Rose proudly stated, oh, yes, I'm his mother. Am I glad to see you, the cabbie said. Your son owes me $1.65.
And then there was this other occasion. I remember the date, February the 15th. And we were up in Wisconsin, and I met a wonderful lady in the crowd who had 13 children. And I said to Jackie, Jackie, why don't you go over and shake hands with this nice lady, and whatever she has, maybe some of it will rub off on you.
Well, I did. And amazingly, almost 9 months to that day, John Jr. was born on November 25th, 1960. But Jack's biggest problem with many voters was his religion. He was Catholic, and there was a fear that he would be under the control of the Pope. Although Harry Truman commented, it's not the Pope I'm afraid of, it's the Pop. But Jack, in his typical style of enjoying a good fight, took the issue head on. He appeared before and spoke to a conference of ministers being held in Houston, Texas.
I believe in America, where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate should tell the president, if he be Catholic, how to act, and where no Protestant minister would tell his parishioners for whom to vote, a place where religious intolerance will one day end. This is the kind of America I fought for in the South Pacific, and the kind my brother Joe died for in Europe. If I lose this election on the real issues, I'll return to my seat in the Senate, satisfied I tried my best. I was fairly judged. But if this election is determined on the basis that some 40 million Americans just lost their chance of ever being president on the day they went and they got baptized Catholic, then it'll be the whole nation who will be the loser. In the eyes of Catholics and non-Catholics, and in the eyes of history, in the eyes of our own people. Well, my victory in the Electoral College was 303 to 219.
Jack's popular vote victory was only some 118,000 votes out of over 68 million cast. Some said there was voter fraud. Others claimed that Jack's father had bought the election.
Well, actually, I've just received a telegram from my generous daddy. Jack, don't buy a single vote more than necessary. I'll be damned if I'm paying for a landslide. My father never sent such a telegram. Actually, he purposely stayed out of the spotlight all during that campaign. And of course, I was very happy to have won. And it was nice to hear that my opponent, Dick Nixon, could find a bit of humor even in defeat. He supposedly told one of my aides after my inauguration and my inaugural address how he wished he had said some of the things I had said that very day. So my aide queried, "Really? Well, what part?" And Dick Nixon replied, "Oh, you know, the part that started, 'I do solemnly swear.'"
Jack's inaugural address was so magnificent.
So let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and to foe alike, that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans, born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and around the world. And let every nation know, whether friend or foe, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Next question, sir.
First Lady, what were your feelings on your new role?
Well, first of all, please do not call me First Lady. That sounds like the name of a saddle horse. Mrs. Kennedy will do just fine. And I'll answer that by telling you what I told our Chief of Protocol. The children come first. I want to do as little as possible in that framework. When I was told there were certain things I had to do as First Lady, I retorted, I don't have to do anything. I did not want to serve on committees, meet with organizations, nor waste my time meeting with dignitaries from every little country around the world. If I were to add political duties to what I did, I would not have had time for the children. And I mean, if you bungle raising your children, I don't think anything else you do in life matters very much. The American woman wanted an example to follow from the First Lady. Well, that would be the example I would set. When I was home for at least an hour after lunch, I reserved time for Caroline and John. Nothing interfered with that.
Mr. President, how did you feel about your wife's opinion of her role?
Well, I believe it's up to each First Lady to do what best fits her temperament and her own personal inclinations. You must remember, they are not public officials. Her first duty is still to her family, her husband, and her children. And of course, when her husband's the President of the United States, that duty is considerably expanded. And I'll tell you something else. Jackie mentioned how after lunch was her time with the children. Well, following that, on some of the days, she would spend another 2 hours or so behind closed doors, undisturbed, with a man, her husband. I know there's been a lot said about our marriage. I've heard some people go as far as to say, oh, we don't think they were ever truly in love. And I'll admit, we had some rocky moments, but we did cherish these little afternoons together.
There were no phone calls. No official business was sent up. This was our time. We'd listen to records, and again, contrary to many public opinions, we would even discuss political matters between us. Chuck valued my insights. As I had done before, I continued to help him with his speech writing. These were pleasant times for us, but they did not occur as often as we would have liked. For Chuck's 1,000 days in office were filled with one crisis after another.
You know, one of my aides counted 16 crises in the first 8 months of our administration, and among those was the infamous Bay of Pigs invasion. On April the 17th, 1961, now please remember, we had only been in office for 3 months. The invasion by the Cuban exiles who had been trained by our CIA did take place, and it was a stunning defeat. Of their 1,500 troops, 400 were killed, and all of the remainder were captured.
Chuck was in tears all day and extremely depressed.
So what went wrong? Well, in the end, I was determined United States forces would not be used. I specifically asked, would this plan succeed without our direct military intervention? And the answer that the experts gave me was yes. And they were pathetically wrong. Publicly, I made this statement. You know, there's an old saying that victory has 100 fathers, but defeat is an orphan. I am the responsible officer of this government. But privately, I just said to myself over and over and over, how could I have been so far off base? All of my life I've known better than to trust the experts. How could I have been so stupid as to let that thing go ahead?
While Chuck was handling these presidential situations, I was already plunging myself into the one accomplishment I desired, restoring the White House.
Now, Jackie will probably give you right now some big idealistic reason of why she did it, but the fact of the matter is my wife just loved rearranging our homes.
Chuck, it looked like it was furnished by department stores. There was no sense of history about it. There was nothing predating 1900 even on display.
Go right ahead.
But I knew that tampering with the mansion had been a controversial topic in the past, and Congress always seemed reluctant to finance such programs. But I had an idea to solve the money problem, an idea that had been in the back of my mind since I was 11 years old. That was when my mother took me on a trip to the White House. There wasn't even a book that you could buy for a souvenir or to tell you its history. So I conceived of the White House Guidebook, a beautiful paperback book with colored pictures to fund the purchases. And it still continues to this day for that purpose. The White House Historical Association was born to oversee the fundraising. I also used my influence to have Congress declare the mansion a museum, at least the public areas. That way a curator could be hired, so hopefully the furnishings would never again fall into a state of disrepair. The culmination of all this work took place on February 14th, 1962, when I took the American people on a televised tour of the restored mansion. And by the way, won an Emmy Award for the program. Well, with the mansion restored, I brought to it the greatest in the world of culture to entertain, although Chuck had no interest in the opera, and oftentimes dozed off during the symphony.
But I did like Chubby Checker's The Twist. And also the old songs that my brothers and I used to sing together, like Heart of My Heart. You remember that, right? Or how about this one? Won't you come home, Bill Bailey? Won't you come home? I think that was my all-time favorite song.
The only music Chuck really appreciates is Hail to the Chief. I pressed my husband hard for creating a cabinet position for the arts, and although this never occurred, the final result was the latter establishment of the National Endowment for the Arts. Then, along with Mamie Eisenhower, I was named honorary chairperson for establishing the National Cultural Center, which would eventually become known as the Kennedy Center. I also kept a sense of history about Washington, D.C. itself, as I headed up an effort to stop redevelopment of Lafayette Square directly in front of the White House and save many historical buildings. I suppose I was doing more than I ever planned to do, but it was what I wanted to do.
And Jackie became a fashion setter as pillbox hats and bouffant Jackie hairdos began to be worn by the women all over this country. And Jackie got all this praise and all the publicity while I got all the bills. $20,000 to $40,000 a year. Jackie, you are breaking me with this spending. The president's salary is only $100,000 a year. You're wasting 20 to 40% of it on these clothes. This has got to stop.
Chuck, I have to dress well, so I won't embarrass you. As a public figure, you'd be humiliated if I were photographed in some saggy old house dress. Everyone would say your wife is a slob. They would refuse to vote for you. Maybe if Jack hadn't given away all of his salary to different charities, he wouldn't have minded as much.
Mr. President, I hate to go back to the Bay of Pigs, but do you think it adversely affected your presidency?
Oh, I know it had an effect on my relationship with the Russian premier, Mr. Khrushchev, yes. My first summit meeting with him occurred less than 2 months after that Cuban debacle. And at the end of that summit, I believe he thought I was a weak president because of it. And it could have been this feeling that allowed him to make two rather bold moves, first in '61 and then again in '62. It was only 2 months after the summit that the Russians began to erect a wall in East Berlin to try to stop the flow of people who were fleeing over into free West Berlin. And there were some in my administration who wanted me to challenge the Russians with war over this. But my answer was, listen, all wars start from stupidity. Now, God knows I'm not an isolationist, but I just think that it would be particularly stupid to risk killing 1 million Americans over an argument about Germany. Because if I ever challenge the Russians with what will now probably be a nuclear war, it's going to have to be for a more important and a much bigger reason than that. And the Russians supplied that reason. In October of 1962, U-2 reconnaissance photos showed the presence of missile bases being assembled on the island of Cuba. Now, first the Russians denied it. Then they said, well, they're just defensive missiles. But further photos showed the definite presence of offensive missiles that could strike the United States and other countries in the Western Hemisphere. So a special committee, we called it XCOM, was formed to come up with an answer to the situation. And we knew some answer had to be given if the United States was going to continue to have any standing at all in the world. But day by day, the situation grew worse. On Saturday, October 20th, I called Jackie, who is now at our rented home in Virginia, Glen Orca, and I told her to come to Washington and to bring the children. We took a walk together in the Rose Garden all alone. Now, Jackie, we could be at the brink of a nuclear war with the Russians over the situation in Cuba. Now, many different plans have been put forth, but I've decided on a quarantine, a blockade of the island. But I still want you and the children to go to the underground shelter and stay there.
No, Jack, I'm going to stay here. I'm not going to leave you alone in the White House. On October 22nd, 1962, at 7 p.m., Jack addressed the nation.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. We are initiating a naval blockade of Cuba, and any ship found to be carrying offensive weapons or missile firing equipment will be turned back. And it shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere to be an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response on the Soviet Union.
At the same time as this public announcement was being made, Mr. Khrushchev and Jack were exchanging private letters in which the Russian premier seemed to be reconciliatory, although publicly Mr. Khrushchev said that their ships, a fleet of which were rapidly approaching our line of ships, would not honor the blockade.
We had 180 ships in the Caribbean. thousands of troops ready to invade, and we had B-52 bombers in the air, fully loaded with atomic weapons. But the ships kept getting closer to the blockade line. Now Russian submarines were spotted among them. And then suddenly the message came. The Russian ships had stopped dead in the water. Some had even began to turn around. And that is when Dean Rusk made his rather famous statement, "We're eyeball to eyeball," and I think the other fella just blinked. The crisis was not over at that moment, but eventually those missiles were disassembled and they were returned to Russia. I gave all members of XCOM a silver calendar of October of 1962 with the 13 days of the crises slightly raised. And I got one extra, which I gave to my wife.
And maybe one should have been given to our children as well, because Jacques' reaction to this provocation might have been different if he had not had children of his own, about whom he cared deeply, as he told his close friend, Dave Powers.
If it weren't for the children, it would be easy to press that button. Well, not just John and Caroline, not just the children here in America, but the children all over this world who are going to have to suffer and die because of a decision I have to make.
But Jacques, through his own children, came to a better understanding of all children. He loved reading to Buttons, his nickname for Caroline. He especially liked telling her stories that he would make up himself. And he was even able to laugh as she walked into a press conference like this, wearing my size 10 shoes. And with John, well, there was a special relationship. They just loved one another. John could simply roll around on the floor and Jacques would laugh and laugh.
And although the public certainly did worship the public Jackie, they never really got a glimpse of her private side, but I'll tell you who did. White House usher, J.B. West. And this is what he later commented. "Many times I watched her play with the children, and I felt this is the real Jackie. She was so happy, so like a little girl who had never grown up. Many times when she was performing with such grace and authority, I felt now she's just pretending. She really longs for a child's world where she can run and jump and ride horses." Remember that in the position of President and First Lady, many times that private person can be very different from the public persona.
Mr. President, we've talked about 2 crises in your presidency. How about some comments on other non-crisis endeavors?
Well, thank you for the question. There were many things I was proud of, but I put at the top of the list the creation of something brand new that had never existed, the Peace Corps, where we were going to send young Americans around this world to do some good. Then we had the space program, which I guess you could say we were sending young Americans out of the world to do good. Our Alliance for Progress, which sent billions of dollars to Latin America. And I was proud that for the first time, the federal government would now take an interest in mental health issues, something that hit very close to the Kennedy family. And I was proud of our initiative on civil rights, and this wasn't easy. On several occasions, I had to call out federal marshals to enforce our law. On June the 11th, 1963, I addressed the nation on this topic. 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, and yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boast, will never be fully free until all of its citizens are freed.
As Jacques was making the speech, I was relaxing in Hyannisport, 6 months pregnant.
Just weeks later, June the 26th, I stood in Berlin before the largest crowd I'd ever seen in my life. They estimated 1 million Germans were there. Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect, but we have never yet had to put up a wall to keep our people in. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin, and therefore, as a free man, I do take pride in those words, "Ich bin ein Berliner."
I was still resting in Hyannisport a few more weeks along in my pregnancy.
August the 5th, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was officially signed by the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. This was a very happy day in my life.
I was still resting in Hyannisport, now 8 months pregnant. 2 days later, I took Caroline and John horseback riding. I went into labor and had to be rushed to Otis Air Force Base Hospital. All the way there, I kept pleading, please, hurry. I do not want this baby born dead. We finally arrived by cesarean birth. Patrick Bouvier Kennedy was born.
The moment I heard of Jackie being taken to that hospital, I left the White House.
Patrick weighed only 4 pounds 1 ounce. He was so sick. The Catholic chaplain was asked to come and baptize him at once.
We immediately moved Patrick to Children's Hospital in Boston. And I was there, holding on to that little tiny hand, when at 5 a.m. on August the 9th, my son died. He put up quite a fight, Jackie. Oh, he was a beautiful baby.
Jack, there's one thing I couldn't bear now. If ever I were to lose you.
Days later, Patrick was buried. I placed in his coffin my St. Christopher's medal, which Jackie had given to me on our wedding day. And as they lowered that little coffin, I said, goodbye. It's awfully lonely down there. And Jackie was still too weak to even attend the funeral.
On September 12th, we celebrated our 10th wedding anniversary with Ben and Tony Bradley and other family members. And I gave Jack a new St. Christopher's medal.
And I gave Jackie a gold ring with emerald chips in honor of Patrick.
Then my sister invited me to spend some time with her, an acquaintance of hers, Aristotle Onassis, on his yacht. Well, I cruised on the Christina with Ari, my sister, and other couples. Ari was a truly fascinating man. I returned home rejuvenated, ready to help my husband.
Now, maybe you'll come with us to Texas next month.
Sure I will, Jack. I'll campaign with you wherever you want. On November 10th, we spent the weekend at the newly finished home of our own, Wexford in Virginia. This was to be our home away from the White House for the rest of this term and for the next 4 years. Then on November 13th, Jack, Caroline, John, and I spent a relaxing afternoon watching kilted bagpipers perform on the White House lawn. The next night, Adlai Stevenson, our UN representative, came for dinner. He had been spat upon and threatened by a mob in Dallas just weeks ago because of certain stances of his in the UN. He begged us not to go to Dallas. Well, that weekend I spent horseback riding in Virginia while Jack went with friends to Palm Beach in Florida.
We watched the firing of a Polaris missile, then some football on television. Then after dinner, we sat around and we started singing those old songs I loved so much. In fact, I remember on that occasion, I even got up and did a solo of a rather popular tune from Broadway in the late 1930s, the September song. Oh, it's a long, long way from May to December, and the days grow short when you reach September, and the days dwindle down to a precious few. September, November.
November 21st, Houston, Texas.
When we arrived, I asked one of my aides how the crowd looked, and he told me, well, Mr. President, well, your crowd this year is just about the same as it was last year. Oh, but 100,000 more people have showed up to cheer for Jackie. I needed Texas in 1964, and the party was being split by a feud between Senator Yarborough and Governor Conley. Well, one of the purposes of this trip was to see if we couldn't mend a few fences. So from Houston, it was on to Fort Worth, and then into Dallas, where Adlai Stevenson had had his problems. The day we arrived, the Dallas Morning newspaper ran a full-page ad denouncing the nuclear test ban treaty. I said to Jackie, we're heading into nut country. You know, if someone wanted to shoot me with a rifle from a window, nobody could stop it, so why worry about it? But actually, when we reached Dallas on November 22nd. The crowd that greeted us there was huge and happy. Well, Jackie, I think this trip's turning out fine. I mean, here we are in Dallas, and I think everything in Texas is going to be fine for us.
We were riding in a convertible. It was hot. I saw this tunnel ahead and I thought, oh, it'll be cool in the tunnel. Chuck raised his hand to wave to a little boy, and then the gunshots. His last expression was so neat. You know that wonderful expression he would get when asked a question about one of the 10 million pieces of the workings of a rocket, you know, just before he'd answer. He looked puzzled, and then another shot. I got his brains in my hands. Oh my God, what are they doing? God, they've killed Chuck. Chuck, can you hear me? I love you, Chuck. We rushed to the hospital. They wanted to keep me out of the operating room. No, I want to be there when he dies. There was a sheet over Chuck. His foot was sticking out of the sheet. I took his foot and I kissed it. Then I pulled back the sheet. His mouth was so beautiful. His eyes were open. They found his hand under the sheet, and I held it the whole time the priest was saying extreme unction. My husband was dead. Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as president, and we returned to Washington, I still wearing the pink blood-stained suit. I wanted everyone to witness what had been done to my husband. I would orchestrate the entire funeral proceedings and immediately had friends begin to research Abraham Lincoln's funeral. I wanted Jack's to mirror his. I also insisted that Jack be buried in Arlington National Cemetery, and against the wishes of some, devised the idea for the eternal flame to burn at his gravesite. The funeral was conducted with great solemnity, and following it, dignitaries stopped by the White House to pay their respects. But I had something more important to do. As soon as that funeral was over, Caroline, the family, and I gathered upstairs in our private rooms for another ceremony. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear John. Happy birthday to you. My son was 3 years old that day. A little child's birthday is very important to them. It cannot be lost. I am a living wound. My life is over. I'm dried up. I have nothing more to give. Some days I can't even get out of bed. I cry all day and all night until I'm so exhausted I can't function. And then I drink. I spent a weekend with our friends, the Bradleys. When it was over, I had to write them a letter. I said, I consider that my life is over. I will spend the rest of it just waiting for it really to be over. Of course, my life wasn't over. I left the country after Bobby Kennedy's assassination. After all, they were killing Kennedys. And eventually, I did marry Aristotle Onassis. Upon his death in 1975, I stated, Aristotle Onassis rescued me at a moment when my life was engulfed with shadows. He meant a lot to me. He brought me into a world where one could find both happiness and love. We lived through many beautiful experiences together which cannot be forgotten, and for which I will be eternally grateful. I went on to a career in book publishing, had other close male friendships. Most important to me, I raised Caroline and John. Then in 1994, at the age of 64, I joined Jack in the hereafter. Ted Kennedy eulogized me with these words.
She was a blessing to us in the nation and a lesson to the world how to do things right, how to be a mother, how to appreciate history, how to be courageous. No one gave more meaning to the title of First Lady. The nation's capital city looks as it does because of her. In a large part because of her inspiration and vision, the arts are an abiding part of national policy. During those 4 days in November of 1963, she held us together as a family and a country. Afterward, she went to do what she most wanted, to raise Caroline and John. Her love for Caroline and John was deep and unqualified. She reveled in their accomplishments. She hurt with their sorrows. And she felt sheer joy and delight in spending time with them. At the mere mention of their names, Jackie's eyes would shine and her smile grow bigger. In 1963, just days after Jack Kennedy's funeral, Jackie called Teddy White, a reporter for Life magazine, to come out to see her. There was something she needed Life magazine to tell the country.
I kept telling Bobby, I've got to talk to someone. I want to say this one thing. It's almost been like an obsession with me. You know, all I keep thinking about is this line from the musical comedy, Camelot. Well, at night, before we go to sleep, we had an old Victrola. Chuck liked to play records. His back hurt. On an old Victrola, 10 years old. And the song he liked best came at the end of this record. The last of Camelot. Sad Camelot. Don't let it be forgot that once there was a spot for one brief, shining moment that was known as Camelot.
Thank you. Thank you all very, very much. I hope we brought back some memories of the Kennedys. As I look around this room, most of you probably are just like us, and you can remember exactly where you were in November 22nd, 1963, when you got the word that President Kennedy had been shot. It truly was one of the most stunning moments, I think, in our American history. And you know, when we did the research, I guess it really didn't strike, but you know, they were only married for 10 years, and they went through all of that. And then this dear girl, who was very, very young, suffered the death of her baby in August, the death of her husband in November, and then had to basically appear before the whole world, you know, and compose herself. It really is a wonderful, wonderful story. Now, as Sherry mentioned in the beginning, we do 33 presidents, not just the Kennedys. So we do have DVDs on each show, and if anybody is interested, we brought them tonight. Talk to Sue, she'll just be up here. Come on up, she'll tell you about the pricing, etc. And then we will get out of costume and come back and join you in the sing-along and everything else in the back room. We want to get out of costumes because we don't like accidents to happen with spills, etc., etc. But thank you so much for having us, and we'll give the microphone back to you.
Thank you, Sue and Bill. Let's give them another tremendous hand. That was truly wonderful and very touching, and it was such a joy to have you both here.